Okay, we're ready to get started then. And we are recording, right? Okay, yes. All right, so I'm Tom Coleman, and welcome everybody to our meeting tonight. In the past several months, we've had some experts in to our member meetings, which we have every month. We've covered, one meeting was about regenerative agriculture and soil and human health, and trees, one meeting, plastics and microplastics, energy, one meeting, and another meeting specifically on solar. We had an electric vehicles meeting for, private homes or private vehicles, as well as public transit. And then we had a suburban climate advocacy meeting where one of our teams presented. So all these meetings have been recorded and they're all out there in the YouTube channel. So if you haven't already done so, put your name and email address in the chat, and I'll make sure to get a link out to you of this meeting. Anyway, moving to tonight, I'd like to thank Pam Tate for arranging Brian Gill to speak to us and attend the meeting tonight. We're privileged to welcome Brian, who is the Illinois Environmental Council's Federal Policy Director. Brian will talk about the midterms and how they will likely impact climate action going forward. Brian heads up environmental advocacy at the national level for the IEC and its affiliates, working with Illinois delegation for Congress as well. Previous jobs included working with legislative affairs at the White House Office of Management and Budget and consulting in nonprofit and political campaigns. So I'd like to thank Brian for speaking to us tonight, and hope we have a really good meeting. Go ahead, Brian.
All right, thanks, Tom. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. Always happy to see some familiar faces on here, and even more excited to see a lot of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet. As Tom said, I'm Brian Gill. I'm the Federal Policy Director at the Illinois Environmental Council. IEC's focus is sort of as the convener and coordinator of a lot of the in-state public policy around everything environment, climate, clean energy for the environmental community in Illinois. Kind of historically, most of what our focus has been on has been at the state and local level. And about a year and a half ago when I joined, we started up a federal policy department, and we've been much more engaged at the national level. And as Tom said, building relationships with the Illinois congressional delegation, pushing for national policies that affect Illinois, and trying to kind of build that bridge as we'll get into, a lot more federal funding coming down the pike into the state, and how do we best leverage our position and take advantage of that. So I've got some experience coming from both the federal government and from campaigns, even as much as I try and forget my campaign days. They're hard to shake. So hopefully I can bring a little perspective from both of those things to tonight. I would say a couple of things just to start. One, this can absolutely be conversational. So if you've got questions during, feel free to jump in. I will say I'm going to share my screen though, so I won't be able to see the chat. So if you got a question, feel free to jump in, but I've also left a bunch of time at the end for some Q&A and discussion, and happy to do it in kind of whatever format is best for the group. So with that, let me share my screen, and we will get started here. Luckily, I pulled this tab into its own browser, so you won't see my embarrassingly large amount of tabs open in the rest of my Chrome windows. So what I'd love to do tonight is kind of walk you through, just very briefly, because I know a lot of you have heard it, sort of what happened in 2022 around federal climate action, just as a backdrop of the elections and of what we're looking at towards next year. What do those results mean for federal climate action? And then get into what are some of the priorities for 2023 and what to watch, and a couple ways to kind of get engaged and take action. And then again, happy to jump into some discussion. So just recapping 2022, and I will preface this with, I have a lot of slides here with a lot of words, and I'm going to kind of blow through them. I'm happy to share this slideshow. I just, pulled some other slides, frankly, from other presentations on a few of the bills we've done. So they're a little wordy, but I just wanted to kind of get the point across of that there was a lot happening in the past year. So let me start with the good from last year. Congress passed a budget last year. They passed appropriations bills, which is notable for a few reasons, because, takes a lot to get Congress to do a lot, but it also got us out of the Trump era levels of appropriations and budget from the past 4 years, which really took a big hit, especially to programs that we care about, to the EPA, to the Department of Interior, to conservation and wildlife programs, to clean energy programs, really to science. And so passing appropriations bills this past year was a really huge thing, because as we head into a split Congress, if they pass what's called continuing resolutions, we will be functioning at the current levels, which is a lot better than the previous levels. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which you may have heard referred to as the bipartisan infrastructure law. I added in here, I know it passed in late 2021, but a lot of the money started coming in this year. And it's super relevant in partnership with the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. And so I'll mostly spend the next section talking about those two bills. There was also a lot of executive actions this year that I'll kind of do a breeze through as well. All that being said, let me also recognize the bad that happened in the federal government this past year. For one, there was a major Supreme Court decision, namely the West Virginia versus EPA decision, that really hamstrings the federal government's ability, particularly the EPA's ability to regulate emissions coming out of power plants. So that was a big hit. There's no sugarcoating that one. And then, as I'll get into, there were some of the Inflation Reduction Act provisions that just frankly were bad, which, is what happens when you get Bernie Sanders and Joe Manchin to both vote the same way on the same bill, is you get, some of the good and some of the bad. So let me dig into this a little bit. And just for folks here, IEC's engagement, and this is clearly, left over from I believe a presentation to our board, to let them know we were working hard, but we're the state affiliate for the League of Conservation Voters, and so we worked with a really broad coalition nationally to help pass these bills. It was quite a roller coaster ride. We had, I don't know how many meetings with Illinois delegation and their staff. We held town halls and press conferences with members over the past couple of years. And even harder to count amount of pushes for Dear Colleague letters, media, social media, TV, radio. This was really a coalition-wide effort. And when I say coalition, I don't mean just in Illinois. This was environmental partners across the country. So from the top of that list, the current state of appropriations is that no FY 2023 appropriations bills have passed, which is not unusual at this point. The government is functioning on a continuing resolution that holds funding levels at its current levels, which is last year's budget through December 16th. So it'll be pretty interesting to see what happens in this lame duck session post midterms, pre the new Congress coming in. They're going to need to fund the government, but we'll see if they can get some increases in appropriations, or if they just continue the current levels. So the infrastructure bill that was passed at the end of 2021 was over $1 trillion in total spending. There's a lot of provisions in this, but the ones I really want to point out are around clean energy, infrastructure, transportation, and a bunch of environmental resiliency and cleanup portions. this bill, as most spending bills, is a combination of both formula funds, which just feed directly into state coffers at predetermined formulas, and competitive grants that the state will have to apply for. And I mentioned that just because of when we get to the section around what do we do now, and what does 2023 look like, that's particularly relevant. So I'm not going to go through all these. I just wanted to give you a sense of how much happened last year. Money for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, a lot of money for public transit. As I know, Pam and others, we've been working on, there's money for clean school buses. There's money for energy and grid investments, energy efficiency for buildings, schools. There's weatherization assistance programs. Illinois is, as many of you may know, has more lead service lines, lead drinking water pipes than any other state in the country. And Chicago has more than any other municipality in the country. And so Senator Duckworth was a huge proponent of pushing for as much lead service line money as possible in this bill. Unfortunately, it would take about 3 times that amount to actually remediate all of the lead service lines in the country, but it's a really nice start, and we're continuing to work with our office on some ways to pick those up. A lot of money for climate resiliency. Adverse weather events, as this group knows better than most, are just on the rise, and it's just going to be more important than ever to work on flood mitigation and disaster relief. More for if folks are plugged into downstate work than in the Chicagoland area, but Illinois has a ton of abandoned mine lands and orphan gas wells, and so there was actually just a big announcement maybe a month ago, bringing tens of millions of dollars into the state to remediate those. And there's a bunch of Superfund cleanup and brownfield site grants as well. On the Inflation Reduction Act, this was the larger of the bill as far as climate money goes. So while again, the name doesn't exactly say it, this was a massive injection of $370 billion into clean energy programs, tax incentives. Almost all of it was either new programs or boons to existing programs to let them continue to function. So kind of the biggest batch was this 10-year extension of tax incentives for renewables, for batteries and energy storage. There's some really nice workforce incentives and direct pays for nonprofits and co-ops in here as well. There's the $27 billion greenhouse gas reduction fund you may have heard from as the Green Bank. There's a methane reduction program. There's actually just an announcement the other day on methane. And so I won't go through all these again, but the main point here is that it was an extraordinary amount of the largest investment that the U.S. has ever made to combat climate change happened in 2022 and happened not that long ago before the midterms. And so it was we all were kind of wondering how big of a point of conversation would it be heading into elections. So there's a lot of money in there to lower home energy costs. There's a bunch for transportation, including electric vehicle tax incentives that would stack on top of the Illinois passed CEJA incentives. There's money for like reconnecting communities and for air quality monitoring and more for climate justice block grants in here. A lot of incentives around not only for the utilities and for consumers, but also for clean energy manufacturing. So companies that are going to make wind and solar and batteries, and with a particular focus on all of this directed towards low-income communities, industrialized communities, communities that are transitioning out of fossil fuel life. A lot of money in rural and agriculture programs, particularly around climate smart agriculture. A lot of money for rural electric co-ops and protecting against wildfires. More money in public lands and waters. This is it was a lot of coastal work and kind of also rolling back some of Trump's ban on offshore wind. And I would say throughout all of this, and I just put in Illinois' some of Illinois' numbers just to reiterate the point of, how local this all gets, but this is going to inject a lot of money if spent correctly in the state around good paying jobs here in state, here in the Chicagoland area, and across Illinois. As I mentioned, there were a few notable bad things that were put in the IRA to appease mostly Joe Manchin, Senator from West Virginia, but these were kind of the three main ones. For one, there was money for carbon capture and sequestration, which, depends on who you ask, how good or bad it is. But we and League of Conservation Voters, and as I know that many on this call do not support CCS work, the only silver lining there was they did put in some guardrails on it, so it wasn't quite as harmful as it could have been, but still not a practice that we want to be investing more money in. We'd rather invest it in real renewable energy production. And then the other two around offshore and oil and gas leases. So I'm happy to go into it more later in the discussion, but basically, like, it would require oil and gas lease sales on public lands it would require as a prerequisite for holding those on public lands if you want to put renewable projects on those lands, you would have to offer oil and gas lease sales as a prerequisite for that, which is just not a good thing. It also revived a couple for offshore drilling lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico and in Alaska, which are also bad. So I would say, the top line here is that for every bad thing on here, there were about 20 really good things, but there are some programs that we need to fight now, and that we need to, make clear that they are not to be incentivized later. On top of all that, I won't do too much on this, but the bill did a lot of really great things for prescription drugs and expanding healthcare, and closing tax loopholes, and all of that. So it's in the slides for a later time. So this leads us into the elections that took place last week. So want to walk you through just sort of what the backdrop looks like, or looked like heading into Election Day. Nationally, the president is not very popular, and this is by approval ratings, by favorability ratings. So both rating how he's doing in his job and also how much people like him, basically. And then the exit polls just coming out of Election Day just showed people don't particularly, love Joe Biden right now. Usually, and this is especially true in the House, Congress shifts against the president's party in midterms. So I'll show a graphic here in a little bit, but it's not it doesn't happen every time, but 9 out of 10 times there's a pretty drastic shift against the president's party. And I'll say, just going into the night, it got a little bit more rosy for Democrats in the last few days before Election Day, but most of the predictions until just a couple days before Election Day predicted a pretty big red wave. And I don't love using that term, but that's what everyone was sort of bracing for. So what actually happened is that and again, I'm going to cover federal elections here, state stuff. I will leave for other experts. Democrats held the Senate, which was a huge surprise to most. Currently, the Democrats sit at 50 seats to Republicans 49. There's one more Senate seat that still is up for grabs, and that's going to be in Georgia. There's a runoff, I believe, on December 16th between Raphael Warnock, who's the incumbent Democrat, and Herschel Walker, who, excuse me for saying it, is a monster of a human being, and is the Republican candidate. Very good running back, but not good human. The Republicans, as of I believe last night, have officially taken charge of the House. So currently, and this may have changed in the last couple hours. So all of my numbers I tried to update in the last few hours, but may have adjusted since then. Currently, Republicans have 218, which is the magic number for a House majority, and Democrats currently have 211. There are still some seats, I believe 6 seats up for grabs. So 435 is 218 plus 217. So at best, Democrats are one short. The House is a majority rule body, so you don't ever need, I shouldn't say don't ever, you almost never need like 2/3 or 3/4 unless you're getting into some really funky type of votes. But for funding bills, for passing legislation, the House is majority rule. The Senate is a whole different topic, as everyone knows. And there's some ways, like reconciliation, the Democrats were able to pass some stuff this past year, but having a majority in there is still a very big deal. Just, in Illinois, Illinois lost 1 seat in redistricting last year. So we went from 18 to 17. Democrats picked up some seats though, and now hold 14 of the 17 congressional seats, which is up from 13 of 18 last year. There's 4 new members in the Illinois delegation, including Jonathan Jackson, the first, Delia Ramirez, Nikki Budzinski, and Eric Sorensen. Jonathan Jackson took over for Bobby Rush. Delia is in the new Illinois 3rd. Nikki Budzinski took over from, I'm spacing on who was in the 13th before. And Eric Sorensen took over for Sherry Bustos, who retired in the 17th. Tammy Duckworth was also up. She won by, I want to say like 14 or 15 percentage points and about 700,000 or 800,000 votes. It was not close. And then the one other note here, especially, if you're in the 4th, is that Chuy Garcia recently announced he's running for the mayor of Chicago. So if he loses, then he stays in his current position. If he wins, then there will be a special election in the 4th to replace him. So that is that seat is not in danger of not being held by a Democrat, but we may get a new personality in the 4th. So here's the graphic I mentioned of just the House usually, bucking against the president's party, except for 2002 and 1998. And your guess is as good as mine. Why they held there. Maybe people really liked Clinton the second time around, or really liked Bush the first time. But other than that, since for the last 30 years, 40 years, this is only the 3rd time, or I shouldn't say that because Democrats did lose seats, but it was a much smaller amount than usual. Outside of 1986 and 98 and 2002, even if Republicans ran the table on these last 6 seats, the plus minus is lower than usual. Couple fun facts I found just looking over data and reading inhaling election news, as I'm sure many of you have over the last week or so. If Senator Warnock, and again, that's in a runoff, and if Lisa Murkowski, who's a Republican from Alaska, but they have ranked choice voting, which means she may lose to a different Republican in Alaska. It's very close. But if the two of them both end up winning, it'll be the first time in over 100 years that no incumbent senator running for re-election has lost, which is pretty stunning. Even again, if Republicans run the last 6 House seats, it'll be the smallest number of House seats lost by the party in power in the last 20 years. And this is only the second time since 1934 in the last 100 years that the opposition party, so in this case, the Republicans against the sitting Democratic president, have lost seats in both the US Senate and in governor's races around the country. Couple more. The opposition party has gained state legislative chambers in every midterm in the last 20 years. So usually flipping a lot. Republicans have currently lost 3 of chambers. I believe Michigan and Minnesota, and I'm missing one, and Pennsylvania I think is still up for grabs. That is pretty stunning that in a midterms this trickled down to state races, especially in Democrats' favor. Democrats historically don't do as well in state races and midterms. Similarly, first time since 34 that no state houses flipped against the party, and the first time since 1986, and only the second time since 1934 that the opposition party has had a net loss of governor seats. So this election really hit at all levels in a really unusual and interesting way. So I think one of the questions that we want to answer is, what role did climate progress legislation and as an issue play? And I'll be honest, it's really hard to say right now. They're going to do a lot more polling and surveying and exit work after this, and so we'll know more in the I'd say coming weeks and months as they really dig into issues. The 2 issues that are clear that were the main issues of this election were abortion and voting rights. And I can talk about that a little bit more later, but in states that had choice protection measures and voting rights measures on the ballots, Republicans did really bad, and Democrats did much better. So, and that wasn't just, this wasn't an across the board Democrats outperformed, because in places like New York, they did, and California, they did not do particularly well. And so, and those are states that did not have choice and voting rights provisions on the ballot. So I think everyone's pretty certain of those 2, but we'll get a better sense in the coming weeks on what other issues drove voters this year. I've already I used to work for a political analytics firm, and I've already started texting trying to get some inside info from my former colleagues who are doing a lot of this after the fact polling. I will say that even though none of them voted for it, and there was very little criticism of the Inflation Reduction Act by Republicans, which I find stunning considering the amount of funding that went towards combating climate change and Republicans' general disdain for spending on anything that isn't missiles and defense spending. They didn't push back against the IRA on the campaign trail, which to me shows that they knew it was good policy, and they knew that voters cared about it. They didn't, and some of this may have been fancy branding, which Democrats don't always get right, but I think they did in naming it the Inflation Reduction Act and really pushing the inflation reduction portions of the top lines of the bill. But I thought that was just a really interesting takeaway of this whole thing was the Republicans weren't attacking spending on environmental and clean energy programs on the trail. Whether that pushed people to vote for Democrats or not, they didn't use it as a weapon. But overall, like the two bills kind of did give Democrats some big wins to talk about, and just put out a generally positive narrative. And climate was certainly central to that narrative and to as Democrats messaged about the two bills. So hard to say. I think like it certainly played a positive role. Whether it played a central role or not, I'm not sure. All that being said, this is a pretty unusual, complex set of results. Democrats still lost the House of Representatives, so they lose their ability to kind of legislate, with more ease. A split Congress means a lot of stagnation generally, and so even though this was generally an overperforming by Democrats and underperforming by Republicans, that is a enormous top line that we cannot avoid, is that Republicans now control the House of Representatives. And so I will say, it is clear that they underperformed in particularly three kind of areas. One is that in districts, more than states, but districts that Biden narrowly won. So, and I think that is a lot partly to the second bullet, which is that Trump endorsed candidates did really poorly on the whole, especially Trump Senate endorsed candidates outside of Ohio and maybe one or two others. But overall, Trump endorsed candidates did bad, which makes his recent announcement, super interesting, and complicates the 2024 race and certainly complicates the Republican Party for the foreseeable future. And again, just states with abortion and voting rights on the ballot went overwhelmingly against Republicans. So what does that mean for the landscape for federal climate action? And I'm sorry for the next slide, but basically it means that, in short, with a split Congress, not a lot's going to happen in Congress. I will get into where things can happen in a moment, but the House is just not going to pass major environmental and major climate legislation. They may pass. They may be able to work because the Republicans have a really narrow majority. They may be able to pass some bipartisan bills. They may be able to pass appropriations bills and budgets, but kind of nothing the breadth that we saw in this past year and a half is on the horizon. And I think, what I would say is that like that's okay, through the lens that we're not getting major climate legislation every year. For folks that were in the CEJA fight, that took, how many years between FEJA and CEJA? 5, 6. And then FEJA took, I don't know how many years. That predates my Illinois environmental happenings. So there were some big wins last year, and I think it's important to just put that in perspective, that even though we're gonna stall a lot in the next year on legislation, that's not abnormal. I preempted my own slide, but we're probably going to stay at current levels of funding or near on environmental programs. I think will be able to pass budgets to some degree, but you're not going to see these massive increases in like the Department of Interior budget and EPA's budget in the same way that you saw with the infrastructure bill and with getting out of Trump era funds. I should start looking at my slides instead of just ranting, but yes, this is better than Trump era levels. So that's the top line there. It's going to, just get, it's going to be incremental to get anything through Congress though. So where does that leave us in terms of like how we push? A lot of the progress is going to be left up to President Biden through executive action. He's got a couple years to push a lot through rules and regulations and internal agency workings. And so I think, while in general, environmental advocates have been very pleased with the White House and working in tandem with them on a lot of the bills. I don't want to say like pressure is going to ratchet up, but I think in some ways pressure might ratchet up for him to just really like run with the last couple of years and use it to tout some wins, use the popularity of the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act as not just good policy but good politics to push on a lot of executive action. But I think the biggest thing is that this gets us to states action is where the battleground is for the next few years. And I say that in two ways. One is, Illinois went through, I would say it's major fight last year or the year before in passing CEJA, but there's a lot of work to be done to spend this federal money effectively in Illinois to actually get the state to apply for it, which I'll talk about a little bit has been a challenge as I've talked to Pam about recently. And so really pushing the states, I would say states, to frankly be more like Illinois at a state legislative level, and honestly probably be more like California at the executive and how they spend federal funds. So I think I'm getting out of my slides again, but looking ahead to 2023, there's going to be a lot of executive actions. I can send around a link or put it in the chat after this, but the White House put out sort of a roadmap for executive actions, I think about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, where they really want to emphasize executive actions around nature-based solutions, pushing research and innovation around nature-based solutions. It was just not a kind of set of rules and regs that they pushed on in the last year or so. And so I think they see a lot of evergreen policy to be done there. They also want to lead by example. So using rules and regs to be able to do things like, modernize and electrify like the federal fleet, federal buildings, like USPS, things like that is going to be a big push. And so within how the feds spend their own money, there's actually even more flexibility than to use executive action. So I as much as we all kind of wanted the White House to like do a lot of that in the last few years, and they did do some of it, I think it probably was showing some like good political restraint that they were trying to spend all of their time passing legislation while they had majorities in the House and the Senate, and now they can focus on these last couple of years of really pushing on a lot of executive action. And I think building on executive orders around the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, that's going to be sort of the foundation for a lot of the work that they can get through. Coming out of COP27, and I only have a few things here, and I don't want to pretend that I'm like the international finance and climate expert, but there were a couple things that I found notable in just at least the first week and of news coming out of COP. One is that internationally there has been a clear underreporting of greenhouse gas emissions across the board, and I think a lot of this was actually, and you all may know more about this than I do, because I think Al Gore and partners of his were part of pointing this out and putting forth studies and research. So Climate Reality Project's founders are still at the forefront of this, but I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch as the US gets more involved in developing country work. And the second bullet here, which is that John Kerry, who's the kind of climate emissary for the administration, announced that they want to push a public-private carbon market for developing countries. So I think they're calling it the Energy Transition Accelerator, basically to sell carbon credits to companies that are interested in offsetting their emissions. This immediately came under a bunch of scrutiny. People were calling it greenwashing. There's, been a lot of criticism of carbon taxes before. We could do a whole nother session on like why I think the IRA was able to pass versus carbon taxes and cap and trade in the past. And spoiler alert, it's because it's incentive based and friendly to the private sector versus some of the other options. But I think it's going to be an interesting one. So if the US really goes hard in pushing this carbon credit program, they may there's going to be money spent on that and some really interesting news and monitoring coming out of that. And there's a bunch more to come. If other folks, I'd be really curious to hear what other folks are hearing about coming out of COP as well. On the appropriations front, with control of the Senate, Democrats do have some leverage on appropriations, and especially if they get to 51. If they get to 51, they then get a majority in committees, versus if they're at 50, they're even committees. And so that one seat in Georgia could actually have some pretty, not only huge repercussions for the 2024 Senate outlook, but also it gives Democrats more committee members on appropriations committees in particular, but on all committees, to be able to push some of those bills through. And so they'll have a better, I guess, negotiating leverage against the Republican-led House on that stuff. But I think that'll be something that a lot of us, frankly, didn't have time to focus on in the last 2 years, but getting back to some of the basics on appropriations bills and government spending, and luckily they did some good things last year, like funding the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. But that's going to be more of a focus, I think, for environmental groups next year. And then, the big thing, as I mentioned, is implementing these vast sums of money that are new and frankly unprecedented. So it's going to take a group effort to push the governor and state agencies to really maximize the impact here. The big thing that we're hearing is that state agencies are understaffed, and this is across the board. We've heard from IDOT, from Illinois Department of Transportation, from the Department of Natural Resources, that they need people to be able to work on grants, to be able to actually get some of those applications in. And what we haven't heard as direct, but what I think is a concern for us is that, like, what we don't want them to do is be worried about implementing. So if they actually get a grant, do they have people to work on it? So we're doing a few things. We're trying to push on the feds to give some extra flexibility in how some of these dollars are spent, to be able to use in kind of easier and more flexible ways for agencies to staff up. But there's just a lot of workforce challenges right now across the board, and it's going to be a big problem. And frankly, particularly in Illinois, there's a lot of states are in just a better place with their state agencies than we are in terms of staffing. So all that being said, there's not a whole lot of time though to get in the game on a lot of this money. So now is the time to go. So what now? There's a few things I would say. One, something I didn't mention before, but that was, some of you may remember, there's kind of a handshake agreement coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act for Joe Manchin to ensure a vote on a permitting bill, which basically would be able to rush um, uh, oil and gas permits through the system a lot quicker. Um, we don't want that. And so, as much as like Democratic leadership promised him a vote and promised that they would push this, environmental groups made no such promise. And we were pretty clear from the beginning, we didn't like it. We'll take it if that was the only way to pass the IRA, but it is a fight that groups are willing to have, and LCV has been really at the forefront, I know, of combating that. So that may be actually more of a 2022 thing. That may be a lame duck thing, while you've still got Pelosi and Hoyer and leadership in the House who made some promises. They made less strong promises than Schumer and Senate leadership did, but that'll be an interesting one. And then again, I know I'm kind of running long-winded, which is not unusual for me, but really just like winning the win here for Illinois as a smart place to spend federal climate dollars. And I think kind of the overarching messaging we're pushing is, we have the policy infrastructure in place in CEJA. We have a supportive governor. We have an active environmental advocacy community. Like, this is a smart place to get a lot of bang for your buck, to spend federal climate dollars, as long as we can get the agencies, in the game on this. So how do we do that? Like, sharing stories. If you've got good stories from CEJA, from federal funds, frankly, it doesn't even need to be from the infrastructure bill and the IRA. This can be from just, any federal programs. IEC and others can help kind of promote and showcase those stories in a way that, and we can get, we can get in the media, get media coverage. We can share with the administration, share with congressional delegation. But that's a huge play for us. The other thing is, educating the in-state lawmakers and advocates on what are the opportunities, what are the programs, and kind of how do we get that money. And then we're gonna there is some advocacy to be done around regulatory and administration work. It's a different set of advocacy. It's not as it's not as fire and brimstone. A lot of it is like showing up to make public comments on EPA rules. A lot of it is writing letters on proposed regulations to the EPA. A lot of it is, frankly, like working with. We just are through IEC is part of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, which is a huge group of environmental and clean energy and environmental justice advocates in state, of which Climate Reality Project is a huge member. We're working on comments back on what's called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and so. And we're going to work, basically somewhat in partnership with the state to make sure we're where we are in line with them. We're promoting those things extra and making sure that the state knows how we feel, so that when we both send comments back, it looks like we are coordinated and that Illinois is, we're working on from the same team here. But we've probably got some places we disagree with them, and we'll also have. So that's everything I got. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for having me and for listening to my 45-minute rant about elections and Congress and process. I'll happily talk through questions, have a discussion here, but there's my email for anyone that wants to send over questions later, if we don't get to it, or if you think about other stuff later. And below that is just IEC's website, if you're interested in learning a little more about IEC. With that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Go ahead, Pam.
Brian, just two things. When you say that Biden might be putting out executive actions on nature-based solutions, what do you think he has in mind? I mean, what areas, and is there anything we could do to have input into what those are?
Yeah, here, let me put this in the chat. This was just from a couple days ago. So this is, they, you know, put out sort of a roadmap for nature-based solutions, kind of, you know, while they're at COP. There's a lot of interesting announcements being made. So a few things. One, I think they recognize that a lot of the policies around nature-based solutions are outdated. And so there's a general like updating that needs to happen. I think the one they called out in this was on like floods and floodplain management. So like FEMA is revising its floodplain management requirements, heading, which is in like response to an executive order. There's also potentially funding to be had around nature-based solutions. So in like hazard mitigation and climate resiliency, there's I think a section here around combining solar and nature-based solutions in one of the DOE offices. So I think there's a bunch of different avenues to go. I will say, like, if you read through this, it's fairly vague. So I think a lot of us have a lot of questions about exactly what they mean about this when they just say we want to unlock funding for more nature-based solutions. Like, yeah, of course, we all do. But it's a good sign that they're it's top of mind, and I would say like these, you know, fact sheets and announcements they make are also just a good signal to like open the door to advocates to voice what we want. So I think there's a couple ways though to engage on something like this. One is pushing with the congressional delegation. While these are executive orders they're mostly talking about, like Tammy Duckworth gets her phone call picked up when she calls, as does, you know, most of the Illinois House and Dick Durbin. And so you know, making sure that our electeds, especially frankly some of our newer ones, are aware of what we want. And then the other thing is, you know, to be frank, like a lot of, you know, many of us like who work on federal issues have lines to administration officials. And so you know, I know I'll be working on a lot of this stuff. So if there's particular policies you're interested in, or you're I'll try and, you know, point out through ICJC and through some IEC federal updates that, you know, when comments are open, or some avenues for action too.
Thank you. The only other thing real quick is well, no, let me just hold off on that because there are other questions in the chat.
This is my first reading through the chat, so
I'm
bear
sorry.
with me unless someone wants to MC.
Raise your
Ron,
hand if you've got a question. Or
I
we'll
know
look in the
Ron
chat.
had a comment, a
Go
question.
ahead. Was it Ron?
I think so.
Ron, go ahead.
I heard Senator Duckworth being interviewed, and she talked about she wanted to work with Joni Ernst from Iowa to promote biofuels. And, you know, I don't think that they're very viable, but then very often what I hear is that they want to put in carbon capture with the ethanol plants because the ethanol plants are putting out carbon dioxide. And so just wondering if you'd heard anything on that and what your thoughts are about how we can approach Duckworth about some of these ideas.
Yeah, I think so, and you guys have been in her ear longer than I have, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, historically it's been Durbin that's been the major carbon capture advocate in the Senate. And so you know, hearing this from Duckworth was disconcerting. I will say we've been hearing that like Durbin lately has been open to I guess, I don't know, re-looking at his full support around carbon capture. I mean, he tends to, push a lot of things that bring money downstate, and Illinois downstate has a lot of carbon capture opportunities. In general, carbon capture is getting a big push coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't know if folks here, but I was just on a presentation the other day from ICJC where there was a Princeton professor named Jesse Jenkins who kind of presented on here are all the great things in the IRA, and frankly, he was touting a lot of the CCS provisions in there, which is worrisome. I know the technologies have come a long way, but I think the short of it is we've probably spent a lot more time focusing on Durban around CCS work, and we need to get in Duckworth's here as well. Other than I haven't heard too much about her working directly with Joni Ernst, but it's an interesting one. I'm going to take note and reach out to one of her staff to check in on it.
Jeff, you had a question?
Yeah, you mentioned, Brian, you talked about the implementation of federal resources, pushing state and municipalities to take advantage of funding opportunities. Is there some kind of clearinghouse or central point of contact where a municipality can find out what's available and what they have to do to get funds?
Short answer is not really. The longer answer is there's a few different places to look. One of them is Energy Foundation and maybe LCV and maybe even Climate Action Campaign or Climate Power funded a what they're calling the Climate Programs Portal, which is basically an online portal that is tracking all of the climate programs in both the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. They have made the Climate Programs Portal available to local electeds and municipalities in the last couple of months. If you know of municipalities that would benefit from basically like a dashboard of here are all the programs that are out there, I am happy to connect with them and get them credentials to log in to the portal. That being said, Jeff, it's to be frank, it's a little clunky. And you've got to do a lot of like filtering to your specific topics and things like that. It's not the easiest thing, which is part of the challenge here, is just like, frankly, like knowing about what money's out there is half the battle. But that is one option for municipalities.
And if I have a municipality, for instance, Evanston is a place that I work with, how would they get the credentials to get on this site?
Yeah, there is probably like an actual sign up link somewhere that I don't have, but if you either connect me with them or just shoot me a note after this, I can loop you in with the Climate Programs Portal like admin folks and get them connected. They offer like one-on-one training into the portal as well. Again, I will. It's not perfect, but it is at least it's at least something to get started. I mean, each of the departments also has, like, you can go to grants.gov and I think usaspending.gov, and there are other sites that track a lot of this stuff, but it's piecemeal and it's messy.
Okay, and you were Brian at ilenviro.org?
Yeah, I'll put it back in the chat.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hey, John, go ahead.
Yeah, it's really a little bit along the same line. When I see that, and it's at a state level, when you mention that we're understaffed and understaffed versus other states, I'm concerned that while the laws are good, the execution is going to fall apart. And so the question I've got is, how can we as activists know where to put our time? So for example, on the EPA, if EPA under John Kim knows what they're doing, even though they're understaffed, we don't need to push them. We don't need to monitor them that much. But if they don't know what they're doing, then we're going to have to be aware of them, be on top of it, et cetera. So where do we make sure our attention is focused so the execution is right, to have the laws that we like actually get done in Illinois? How do we get that focus? I don't have it. And so I'm asking that question when I hear you're understaffing, and if they're not capable, that's a problem.
I wholeheartedly agree. I would say the two places that we are going to focus the most, at least in the next few months. One is direct to the governor's office, because they need to push agencies and provide agencies with, frankly, with some infrastructure and flexibility to be able to hire more and hire better. If you want a specific agency that has my, I don't know if ire is the right word, but attention right now, it's the Department of Transportation, because they are going to get so much money from the infrastructure bill, and a lot of it goes through formula funds, so they're going to get it no matter what. And historically, IDOT does a really bad job of doing much besides widening roads and creating more opportunities for cars. You guys probably signed on. Pam, you probably did, but we and Active Transportation Alliance and Metro Planning Council and NRDC and a bunch of other environmental groups and kind of planning and transportation advocates wrote a letter to the governor, I want to say back in August, basically saying this same thing, which is there is a lot of money for transportation. Transportation is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas in the country. It's where a lot of the opportunity lies to do good with this money, or to frankly do more of the bad. And they're the ones we've heard, John, that are the most understaffed. I reached out to someone recently about a program in the infrastructure bill called the Carbon Reduction Program, and basically was told, right now we're only focused on electric vehicles because basically we can only do one thing at a time, which was terrifying. And so I would say if you're going to direct your focus in any one agency, it's towards transportation. I would say IDNR is understaffed, but they're better, and they know they are, whereas IDOT is less, is more averse to change, and more used to just inhaling this money and not kind of thinking about environment when they spend it.
So we have time for two more questions. Robin and Pam. Go ahead, Robin.
Yes, Brian, this is a little bit back to the CCS. Do you have insight on, there were, I believe, either 2 or 3 pipeline projects. One of them was called Heartland, and there were a couple of others that were literally going to be pipelines through multiple states, but terminating in Illinois so that they could send the carbon way down in the ground here in Illinois. And all of them seem to want to do that in Illinois. So do you know much about them, and is anybody pushing back on them, or is there one group that's looking into all of these pipelines?
I can answer part of it. I'm definitely not the CCS expert. I'm aware of Heartland, and there is a larger group within the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition that is pretty focused on fighting CCS investment. They focus a lot of their time at Prairie State, and on preventing Prairie State from getting funded to do this, so that they can't sort of just continue to burn more coal.
Right.
so if it's something you're interested in kind of engaging more on, I can happily put you in touch with Scott Allen and some other folks from some different groups within ICJC that focus on this. I do think though, like as you know, Ron alluded to earlier, it's concerning and that Senator Duckworth is being more vocal on this. So I think we do need to, like, frankly, get in particularly Durbin and Duckworth's ears quick about this, so that they understand the concern around it.
Yep, thank you.
Pam, last question.
Okay, it's about the Farm Bill, Brian. I think you know that we've got two teams, one on regenerative agriculture and one on trees, restoration, preservation, agroforestry. And we've created policy recommendations. The leaders of those teams are on this call. And what I'm wondering is, if, since we can't get any other climate action in the next Congress, do you think that we could get some of our policy provisions into the Farm Bill, because it's usually got bipartisan support, and we're just trying to affect mainly the conservation title within it, trying to get more money and incentives shifted into things that will sequester carbon in a natural way rather than through technology. Do you think there's any, I mean, is it worth our continuing to push on that front?
I do think it is. I in general, so the IRA definitely had some money around climate smart agriculture programs and some kind of rural programs and opportunities. I do think that the things like the Farm Bill, and I can't think of another thing like the Farm Bill, but things like the Farm Bill are how we do get things done legislatively in the next year or two. So I'm going to put another just link in the chat, and I think you guys are already all over this, but this was the post that I read the other day from NRDC about climate opportunities in the Farm Bill. So I do think there's room for regenerative practices and how to incentivize that. They talked about food system resilience, as well as frankly, the need to get on offense on this, as opposed to just sort of, taking it as it comes. So short answer is yes, I do think it's something that is worth people's time. And I do think this is the kind of stuff where, like, if we can find, champions on the agriculture committee, we give them, who are like environmental champions on the agriculture committee, we give them some opportunities to actually to run with this kind of stuff. So
do we know if just real quick, do we know if any of the three new congressional representatives are approachable on this or are worth advocating with right away?
So I would say all four of the new reps were all LCV endorsed. So they all, at least in the campaign, said the right things. I'll point out a couple of them. One, Delia Ramirez has a history, like a good history of being very, doing good things on environmental policy. Eric Sorensen has a good history on supporting this stuff. Nikki Budzinski is, more downstate, but just she was working in the Biden administration, and of the four is the one I've had the most conversations with. So I think all of them are approachable. And I think Jonathan Jackson, even who's taken over for Bobby Rush, is an interesting one because like Bobby Rush was on the agriculture committee, which may seem, puzzling being in like Hyde Park and South Side. And he was the first person I ever voted for. I grew up in Hyde Park. But there's a lot of equity and justice pieces, in Farm Bill and in ag policy. And frankly, Black farmers for many, many years have been ignored or pushed aside. And so I'll be curious to see if, Jonathan Jackson ends up on the ad committee as well. What we don't know is who's going to be on what committee yet. They won't do assignments for a little bit. So I think in the meantime, it's worth talking to everyone about it. I mean, Sorensen's in, I know I'm going over time here. Sorensen's in an area that like has a lot of farms. Nikki's in an area that has a lot of farms. So they would be two really good ones to start with. But Pam, my very long-winded way of saying, yes, I think this is worthwhile. And yes, I think we should all work on it this year.
Okay, thank
So
you.
it's 7:15 now. Let's have one last question from Cynthia. And while she's asking, if you haven't put your name and email address in the chat, please go ahead and do that so we can get this information out to you. Thank you.
I just wanted to point out that in the chat, we have some good answers to some of the questions.
I'll get that out. Yeah.
Chris Murphy says the consultants can help local governments learn about what money is available and so forth. And Link put a link in the chat for a website where you can get some of this information, climateprogramportal.org.
Link put in the portal I was referring to Jeff's question.
Yeah, and also within the chapter, Chris Murphy is really on top of a lot of this money and where you can get it. So don't forget to ask her about it if you have a question.
Chris brings up a really just important point here that I, on top of the portal that I should have mentioned, which is this is a really important role for consultants and lobbyists is triaging information like this and being able to take on projects that frankly, like, departments might not be able to because they're new and they're complex. And so I would just echo Chris on this one of, consultants that work with municipalities and local government that is a good avenue to keeping track of this stuff as well. I would, Jeff, wager to bet that Evanston Township has some consultants they've worked with in the past.
Well, that brings us to the end. Thank you very much, Brian. Why don't we give him a little bit of a
Thank you.
hand? Tremendous meeting, good information. I'll get the chat, the information in the chat and the links out to you on this meeting. So everybody who has their name in the chat, I'll make sure to get that out to you. Thank you very much, Brian.
Wonderful. Thank you all for having me. Have a great night.
Take care.